All right. So today we're going to create some abstract backgrounds. So this is one of my favorite trends, and you can do all kinds of things with abstract backgrounds. So whether maybe you're making a poster, you want some just kind of texture in the background, or maybe you're doing some icons like we did yesterday and you want to turn them into an app, all kinds of things. So you can certainly use any of the icons created last week for this project. And what you really want to think about is like your choice of abstract objects really are defined by what your message and what your purpose is. So you kind of think about, okay, what kind of like abstraction can I make on this object or something that relates to it, and then use just principles of art and design elements to alter those and change things around and move those around. So we're going to look at a whole bunch of different tools, a bunch of different ways to make these abstractions, but I have a mood board to share. So I found these on Behance, and so these kind of show you some of the different, like once you've created your abstractions, what you can do with them. So even, something like this, to me, can be a starting place for a poster. And so something that creates texture and depth and goes beyond just, type and color. And obviously you get into packaging and those type of things, fabric prints, all of the applications. So having the same type of abstraction, but doing different things with it. So that gives you an idea of where we are headed today. So we're going to look at some artboards and play with all kinds of tools. So we're going to play with pen, pencil, line segments, do some different things with shapes, play with the blob brush. We haven't done that yet, so that's going to be fun. Get into stroke settings because that's where the cool stuff can really start happening. And then get into our transform and really change those basic things up and creating some random patterns with that. So nothing to download today, but like I said, you can use any of the icons you created last week or play with some patterns today, experimenting with techniques during our Q&A. So in case I forget, before next week, have a full artboard of abstract shapes or icons. And we'll get to that point today in the demo. Just make sure that they are all black, white, and gray. So next week, we're going to look at some different things you can do with color and some other things with effects inside of Illustrator. So let me, without further ado, pop over to Illustrator, get to the good stuff. So I've got a couple of other examples here for you. And so this I wanted to show you as a combination of some random abstraction. So you have these kind of shapes, which in my mind, like this is rice, this is pasta, you have all these kind of things that are, maybe these are some noodles, I don't know. But you can combine icons with these abstractions and create some interesting things. So you can see the repeated elements, and then we flipped them and moved them around and rotated and really did some fun things. And this is an example of how you can really use some color and use some content to create a focal point. So this idea being like waves, life preservers, and then you have the SOS. So that's what I mean by thinking about abstracting your message. All right, so I've got a couple of icons that I'll play with at the end here, but I want us to start out by just, and that's a sneak preview of something I'm playing with for next week, so ignore that. So we're gonna start with grabbing a new artboard. So I've got my artboard tool, and just a word on my workspace, I'm in that Essentials workspace, but I went and grabbed my advanced toolbar. So I've got that advanced toolbar. So I'm going to create a new artboard to start us out. And I can have as many artboards as I want within a project. And I'm just going to do a custom size and have my artboard options. And let's do a 500 pixel by 500 pixel, as that seems to make sense in my mind. I'm gonna hit OK. So there's my artboard. So you can see, again, sneak preview. You can see all of these artboards are different sizes, and that's completely okay. And I can also have content over on my pasteboard. So the cool thing about Illustrator is you can use this pasteboard to design too, and it's visual, and then you can just drag it into your artboard and export from there. All right, so we're going to get started by looking at how we can create just some random shapes using either the pen tool or the line segment tool. So my pen tool right here, and if I click, I'm going to get straight lines. So no matter where I click, I get straight lines. Now my pen tool has both the fill and the stroke. For this, I'm just going to leave my stroke on. And you can see that, like, as I clip things, I'm just making points and moving things around. So that's how the pen tool works. So with a very simple use of the pen tool, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. I can create some kind of just simple lines. Now, if I want to create a line that's not connected, I just need to command and click, and that releases this object so that I can create a new one. And so this is just going to kind of be some different lines, different sizes, and I've just got one hand on the pen tool and then one on my command to kind of move things around. And if I want to make sure that I'm getting a perfectly straight line, I can click and then hold my shift key to get that as a perfectly straight line. I'm command clicking. And so you can see that just creates some random shapes that can be a starting point for an interesting design. I can use my line segment tool much in the same way. So with my line segment tool, I don't have to click and click. I can just drag out my line segments. So instead of a click and click, this is a dragging motion. So for these kind of just straight lines that I want to have as a random collection, the line segment tool works really well. Those are kind of interesting, but if we want to start doing something a little more fun, we can bring in some zigzag shapes. So let me show you how we can do those. So I'm going to go to my view menu, and I want a couple of things to be popped up. I want my grid, because I'm going to use my grid to help create my line segments. And I actually want to snap to the grid too. So now I have both of those in there, and I'm going to use this grid to help me create some zigzag lines. So I'm going to go back to my pen tool, and I can use, you can see it, it's kind of trying to snap to that grid. So I can't end it in weird places. This is going to ensure as I make my zigzags that they are going to be nice and even. So I'm just measuring in between those. And now I've got some nice zigzags. So I've just clicked along that grid and created those. Now I can grab my direct selection tool. Remember from last class, our direct selection tool allows us to grab points and paths. I can use this to modify those corners. I can also select multiple points and then edit them. So if I wanted this zigzag to be a little shorter, I can just select all of those peaks and bring those down. Another way I can create zigzags, this time I'm going to use my line segment. I'm going to draw my line, and there's actually an effect, and we'll get more into effects next week, but just as a preview for you. In your effect menu, you have two different types of effects. You have Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. Remember week 1 we talked about how Illustrator is a vector-based. If we add a Photoshop, that means we've added rasters to our vectors. And the only thing that we need to think about is it could impact our ability to scale and have it look really good. But these are worth exploring and going through and finding out some interesting things you can do, especially with what we're doing today as far as the distortions and the random objects. So I'm going to add a zigzag to this line, and you can see immediately my preview button is checked. Now, the stroke is still this red line. So the zigzag is actually just an effect. And I can change how this looks, so I can make that smooth wavy line or have the corners, and then hit OK. Now if I actually want to be able to edit this line, what I want to do is what's called expand the appearance. So I go up to Object, Expand Appearance, and now I have those points along that line. So I can do things like kind of clean it up, like maybe I don't want this point here on the end, so I'll just delete that, and maybe I don't want that one. Actually, I do want that one. So it just allows you to kind of change those a little bit. You can get that similar look, remember, if we direct select our peak, and then I can pull these down. And so that kind of creates a similar sort of look. So kind of a couple of different ways to do the same thing in there. All right, now we're going to move on to squiggles. So we've done some zigzags, we've done some wavy lines. Let's do some squiggles. So we're going to grab our pencil tool. So I just want to point out that underneath the pencil tool is another tool we're going to use called the smooth tool. So I'm going to grab my pencil tool. I've got a nice stroke, so I'm fine with that. I'm going to bring that up just a little bit. And so my pencil tool actually creates those shapes for me. So I can create all kinds of interesting random squiggles of, varying sizes and heights, and just kind of whatever speaks to me. And so these are kind of interesting because we start to get into some interesting organic shapes. And again, I can grab my direct selection tool and then edit any of these points that are in here, delete any of those, and then I can use my smooth tool. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see all these different points, and especially this corner is a little rough. So if I grab my smooth tool, I'm just going to run that tool right along this path, and look what's going to happen. It's just going to kind of smooth this out so it's not as sharp as it was. And so I can continue with my smooth tool, like maybe I want to hit it up over here, so I'm going to grab my selection tool again, grab my smooth tool, and again we'll just kind of smooth those kind of rough areas out. You can also create these type of squiggles with your blob brush. So I'm going to grab the blob brush. Now the blob brush will kind of create like a fill type of look. One of the things I like to do with my blob brush, once I've selected it, I hit my return or enter key, and that allows me to bring up my options. That's true for any tool, but I always like to check this, especially on my blob brush. So I want to just make sure that I have a really smooth fidelity on my blob brush. And this is really dependent on kind of how you're drawing and what you look like, what look you like. This may change if you're not using a trackpad, if you're using a mouse, if you're using a Wacom tablet. So keep that in mind. It's interesting to play with these kind of variations of sizes and things like that. We're just going to keep it a fixed size right now, but I encourage you to kind of play with some of these options as you get into the blob brush. So I'll come down here, and again, we're just going to create some kind of squiggles. So you can see how these are similar, a little heavier, because I'm using a 3-point stroke on my blob brush, but very interesting to kind of create that. And the way that wave is correcting, that's because we have that smooth on. I'm going to select these and show you how these are a little bit different. So notice I don't have the direct selection path like I do here. Even though we were using a stroke, it creates that kind of filled look. So that's what the blob brush, think of that as almost like a painting of a whole section. So our next category is organic shapes. And I think organic shapes are one of the more fun things you can create. So I'm going to go back to my pencil tool. And so what I want to do with my organic shapes is create some shapes that have a closed path. So I'm going to just make sure I've taken off my snap to grid. I don't want anything snapping with this because I want it to be organic, and I can choose to hide that grid or not. I'm going to keep the grid up, but I don't want it snapping. So I'm just going to draw some shapes. And I want to come back here and see that circle I'm getting next to my pencil? That means I'm closing the shape. I make sure we have a stroke on there. There we go. And so I can just kind of layer these in, either thinking about how they relate to each other or just kind of randomly creating some organic shapes. I can always go back with my smooth tool, and if I need to kind of smooth out any areas, I can do that, just like we did before. So organic shapes. I can also use the blob brush to create organic shapes. So I'm going to slide over here and we'll do the same kind of thing. And I can even make these into, there we go. I can even kind of group these together, and I'm actually going to fill these shapes because I want to point this out to you. Actually, let's do it this way. Let's fill these because that's going to be interesting comparison. I want to have a little conversation about weight of objects. Now let's do another blob shape right over here. Switch that. There we go. Okay. All right. So I wanted, this is a good time when you have these kind of organic shapes to talk about weight of objects. So if we look at these 5 objects, this one really draws our attention because it's filled in. Now if I grab it and scale it down, see how that changes that object in its space? Then comparing our blob brush to our pencil tools, these really stand out. So as you're creating things, like think about how the fill or the weight of the stroke can change how things appear. So got some organic shapes there. So let's do some shape tools, and we've already played a little bit with these, but I just want to show you a couple of different things. So I'm going to start with my rectangle, and I'm just going to draw a square. Once I get my square, I can rotate this around. So there's my 45-degree angle. Grab my selection tool, and I can select different points, and if I want to shift these out, look at that, I can get a triangle, get an odd pattern. If I just select one of them, bring it in, gives me my diamond. This is where that grid is pretty handy, so I can make sure that those stay on the same grid line. So I can create a diamond shape, and then if I want to start copying these shapes, I can grab my selection tool and alt copy. So this is where you can start combining some of those together. Now for what I'm doing, I'm specifically designing everything in black and white. Typically when I do this type of abstraction, I do start in black and white. I always like to kind of do my coloring as a last bit. So other things I can do, I'm going to grab my circle and let's do a nice ellipse here. Grab that direct selection tool. So again, same thing, I can manipulate these handles and start to get some really interesting, different type of shapes. So then my ellipse kind of becomes, maybe a leaf type of shape. So that's kind of interesting. I can also, with my ellipse, decide to delete points. So let's switch this. So we're just doing a stroke here. And so I'm going to delete this point down here. And now I've got a half circle. And so that's kind of interesting. And if I grab this again, let's do another one right beside it. I can join these two together. So this is kind of a cool trick. So what I've done is just overlapped these shapes, and I'm going to join those two paths. So if I come down here, I just want to make sure that those are right together. I'm going to select both of those points, and we're going to join them together. So now this is all one shape. So I've kind of created this kind of cool shape, which is very similar to what we have up here. So I can change the distance of that, kind of get a sideways S. And finally, my polygon. As I draw my polygon, if I use my up and down arrows, I can get additional shapes. So that's kind of how I can start creating triangles. And I think an interesting combination of just geometric shapes serves as an interesting backdrop as well. Maybe not everything needs to be perfect. So even this grouping could be something interesting. So next, I want to look at our stroke settings. So we're going to play with some different strokes. So we're going to start looking at this. And I want us to pay attention to these ends right here. So I'm going to click on my stroke. And of course, I can increase the size of it. But then I have caps. So right now, this is an end cap. So my points, I select it with my direct selection, go right to the very end. Here I can round it. So then it starts to look a little bit different when I start to round things. These are my joins, or excuse me, this is my butt cap. So it ends before the final point. Let me find that square. This is another. So look at my joins that I'm going to get here. Let's round those. You can see I just got a little bit of a bevel. We'll increase the size. You see that a little bit more. And then here we have like a picture frame bevel on that. So anytime there's a join, I can also manipulate my stroke settings and start to get a completely different look. Aligning the stroke, so I can align it to the inside or the outside. And I'll just, where that starts to make a difference, and we're going to get more into the appearance panel next week, is I can add multiple strokes on an object. So let's, with this first stroke I have, we're going to align it to the outside. So here's my path, here's that stroke. I'm going to add an additional stroke. And this stroke, I'm going to have it align to the inside, and we're going to change its color to gray. So I can add in different strokes to objects and kind of even add further into that. Finally, let's go up here. We'll play with some of these. I did these super tiny. Just little baby shapes. All right, so I'm going to select all of these. So these are just, let's make these a little larger so it gets more interesting. All right, so of course I can come in, round these. I can also play with the dash. So if I want these to be a circle, my dash is 0 because I'm actually just using the weight of the stroke, and my gap, I want it to be about double what the weight of my stroke is. So if I made this smaller, what's going to happen is you're not going to see anything. It's just all kinds of rounded bumps. And maybe that's the look you want. but about double is a good rule of thumb. Now if I make these the butt cap or the projecting cap, I'm going to get different looks at it. So that's using that dashed line. You also have some arrowheads you can play with. So where things start and where things end, all kinds of interesting, funky, weird things you can get with those. So that gives you all of these kind of cool things you can use. So I'm going to now do a new artboard. And with my new artboard, we're going to start randomizing things. So same thing as last time. I'm just going to go into my artboard options, naming my artboard. We're going to call this my black and white abstract 1. And let's just do another 500 pixel by 500 pixel and hit OK. And so what I'm going to do is, this is kind of like my sketchbook. This was kind of like just kind of throwing some ideas together and putting things together. So I'm going to grab this little set right here. I'm really liking those, and I'm going to copy them. And then I'm going to pop into my layers panel. So layers in Illustrator is one of those do as I say, not as I do thing, because I'm not really good at keeping up with my layers, and I'm one of those designers who always has to think of layers at the last moment. But be smart and don't be like me. So we have been working on this curved lines one here, and we're going to create a new layer. And we're going to name that our black and white abstract 1. So it's going to get the same name as our artboard. And so I've named it black and white abstract 1. I'm going to copy these shapes from that curved lines onto black and white abstract 1. And we're just going to move that over so that they're kind of in their own layer. They live over here with this artboard on that layer. And now we're going to start making something into these. So I'm kind of partially using my grid just to kind of figure out the size of things. And so I'm going to do one more, just alt copy this. And I kind of want this one to live up here, but I'm going to reverse it. So these are some of the things you can do as you start to kind of thinking, and I just want to fill those two parts of the grid. So I'm happy with that. That's interesting to me. I'm also going to shade these a little bit. So I'm going to, inside this fill, just do a couple of different shades of gray. I'm going to do a medium gray, and then we'll do a light, actually make it a little bit darker so we can see it. And then we will do, let's do another medium gray. Okay. And that's just going to help us recolor later. It gives me an idea of where I might take my colors as far as the overall kind of design aesthetic of that. Now, once I get these arranged, I can do a couple of different things here. So I'm going to go back to my properties panel, and I can start looking at like how I might want to align these and how I might want to space these out. So I can, if I decide, you know what, I actually want them to be aligned at the top, I can do that. If I want them aligned to the centers, so I can play with those alignments. I kind of like that aligned to the center. I like that look. And now I can distribute my spacing. I'm going to choose to align to the selection. So they're just going to align to each other, distribute that spacing, and I can set up, you know, if I have other objects there, I can distribute that spacing. So I'm pretty happy with that overall alignment. So now I'm going to start transforming these and really just kind of copying them. So how I do that, just going to zoom out for us a little bit. So once I get things copied, I can just alt drag them across this line. And so my trick, because if I copied these then down another row, it's all going to look the same. So my little trick for that is I always go off the pasteboard. So I have a nice long line, and then I'm going to realign those because I might have not got those aligned. So I'm just going to select them all again by marking over them, and again use that align to the center. And I'm not so much worried about my spacing, but again, if I wanted to get in there and kind of redistribute the spacing, I could do that as well. So I'm going to copy these down. So I can just Alt and drag and bring those down. And then if I'm feeling a little lazy, I can use my favorite thing in the whole world, which is transform again. So I'm just going to hit Command D, and they're just going to transform all the way down. Now this is where I can start kind of making these a little more random. I can shift them all the way over here, and now I've got a different starting point. And maybe for this row, I'm going to just shift them a little bit. And then this row, we'll shift about halfway. And so I use this shifting technique to kind of change that starting point and making it look a little bit more random as I go through. Excellent. And then I can clean things up just by deleting these off the edge. No big deal. Getting the loose ones out of the way. All right, so we've got kind of a cool pattern, and really this right here could be enough. I could take this and start playing with this as my abstraction, as my background, as my pattern, however I want to do this. But I'm going to transform it even further. So I'm going to select everything on my artboard, and I'm going to go up to Object and Transform, and transform each. And you can already see crazy things are about ready to happen here. So I can play with all kinds of things here. I can play with the angles that they are at. If I feel like I wanted to scale them, I could scale them in some interesting ways. These are really, the scale is really dependent on the type of objects you have. It doesn't always work successfully. You know, how much move do I want to have these to have in them? And so the final thing I always have that random checked. Now you can choose to reflect and do random and all of these things. Always make sure you're transforming scale, strokes, effects, and have that preview button. So I'm kind of liking how this is kind of turned out, and this to me is kind of interesting. So I'm going to hit OK. And this is where I'm going to start creating a little more randomness in here. So I'm just going to go in and kind of tweak things around. So I'm just going to move stuff to where I feel it might be needing, and I might rotate. And so I'm just looking at, you know, kind of empty areas or areas where they're overlapping. And that's eventually how I get an interesting overlapping pattern, is just creating those shapes and going in there and repeating it. So I like that you've kind of had Illustrator help you, but then you're also manually doing some things. All right, so the final thing I want to show you, we're actually going to use our little diamonds for this one. So I'm going to pull this diamond down here so we've got a nice little collection. And again, we're going to do another artboard, this time down here. And we're going to call this our, go to our artboard options, and we're going to call this our diamond pattern. And we'll do 500 by 500. Okay, so now we are going to actually make a pattern in Illustrator. So we're going to take our 4s, and again, let's get our layers organized. So we'll do another layer. The cool thing about layers is that if you actually do them, you can export your layers as separate objects, and that's usually pretty helpful for client work. Now I am going to transform this a skosh. I want to kind of, and there's all kinds of different ways this is kind of like Heather's lazy way of doing a pattern. If I was doing this professionally, I would probably do some masking in here just to make sure. I've got kind of some interesting objects. So I'm going to go up to Object and Pattern, and I'm going to make a pattern. So you can see already it has created a pattern from this little set, and I can hit OK. So there's that little pattern right there that we created, just like that. Now I can, from this, create an additional one. So if I wanted to do these kind of looks and just kind of play with what that offset is. And so I'm really kind of liking this. So let's go ahead and we're going to save this as our full diamond. And there's all kinds of things I can play with here. I'm going to save a copy of that. Hit, oops, we'll call it diamond 2. Okay. So now we've got both of our patterns in the swatch panel. We're going to go back. And so I can delete that. And I'm going to do a rectangle because these are swatches. So this applies like any other color. So there is our pattern that we created. Now the difference between what we did here and what we did here with our pattern maker is this is an actual swatch. So it applies just like any other color that we have. So that is a look at kind of some random patterns and cool tools you can use. I'm going to go ahead and pause my recording.